Hello, welcome to another episode of Reasonable Discourse. I'm Terry Young along with Shawn McAvoy. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's been in the news recently because of some legislative action in North Carolina. But it also goes back many years, and we have a real close connection to the topic today here in Virginia. And today, Shawn, we're going to talk about eugenics, or you can correct me if my Greek is wrong, but I think that means something along the effect of well-bred, well-born. So could you tell our viewers, because this may be a topic that a lot of folks are not familiar with, what eugenics is all about?
Eugenics comes from the late 19th century, the idea of creating the perfect human race without disease, without impurities, as they were defined in the late 19th century. That goal was partially achieved, but only in as much as the racist part of it. Very early, many scientists and legislators saw opportunities for using eugenics to breed out certain elements of the human population.
Okay, now what you're describing really sounds, I think a lot of viewers would think this sounds very much like the sort of philosophy that we heard in World War II from Hitler in Germany. And what are the connections between eugenics and Hitler's program?
The Germans were very interested in eugenics from the early 20th century, the Nazi Party in particular. However, they did not have a eugenics program put together. They had a lot of theorists. They didn't have a lot of practical experience. When they wanted to look at practical experience in 1932-33, they went to countries who were much more advanced. Great Britain in particular, and the United States. In fact, the U.S. was a world leader in eugenics. Virginia was the leading state in eugenics since 1924, where we had been sterilizing people we considered, in the legal terms of the times, feeble-minded imbeciles. Rapists was put in there, and also anyone of an undesirable ethnicity.
Could you tell us a little bit about the Virginia statute in the 1920s that basically led to the creation of this program?
Actually, there are two of them that are interrelated. They went into effect the same day, actually. In 1924, the Eugenical Sterilization Act, which provided the legal foundation, not just for Virginia, but for the entire United States, on what were the legal underpinnings behind forcibly sterilizing somebody. Alcoholics, epileptics, anybody with mental issues, people considered to have criminal tendencies, which is where ethnicities got tied in. And the same day, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was passed. And that, for the first time, formally defined whiteness in Virginia. A white person could only be 100% Caucasian or have no more than 1/16 American Indian blood. Anything else wasn't white. And the two laws worked hand in hand to essentially preserve whiteness and to make sure that so-called impurities were taken out of the rest of the population.
And if someone's wondering about the 1/16 Indian blood, that was actually a concession to the descendants of Pocahontas, according to the statute, right?
Exactly, most of whom are the leading families of Virginia.
And this Racial Integrity Act in 1924 was accompanied by a law that prohibited whites in Virginia from marrying anyone of a different race.
That was part of the Racial Integrity Act. Whites were forbidden from marrying anyone other than legal whites in Virginia. It had to be certified by a special certificate at birth. State officials basically swore to your whiteness. A very interesting period in our history, no doubt.
And in fact, it would be a Virginia case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967, Loving versus Virginia, that finally miscegenation statutes, anti-miscegenation statutes were overturned, which allowed for people of different races to get married. But before we get to that case, and we won't talk about that case today, let's talk about another case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court from Virginia, and that was in 1927, dealing with this statute, and that was a famous case of Buck versus Bell. And you described some of the types of individuals who were impacted by this statute. In this particular case, it was a young lady named Carrie Buck from Charlottesville who was a teenager who was staying with a foster family. She ended up being sexually assaulted by a member of that foster family, a distant relative, became pregnant, And her foster mother, in order to sort of pass the blame along to the young woman who was the victim, took her to an institution, said that she was promiscuous because her mother apparently had multiple illegitimate children. And so this case from Virginia proceeds to the U.S. Supreme Court about whether or not Virginia has the right to forcibly sterilize this young woman, Carrie Buck. And quite famously, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of the more famous Supreme Court justices, a former Union officer in the Civil War, his father a famous American poet, basically says that you either deal with individuals like this before they're born, or after they've committed criminal acts and you have to execute them, or because they die because they can't take care of themselves. And famously he uses the language, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And he upholds this Virginia statute, and tragically that will lead to thousands of more forced sterilizations in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting things about this, and I think we can see how tragic this statute really was, is that Paul Lombardo, who was a professor at the University of Virginia for many years in law school and medical school, interviewed Carrie Buck late in her life and said that she was an avid reader, a person of average intelligence. There was nothing about her that made her mentally handicapped or in any way, the term that Virginia liked to use, feeble-minded. And so you wonder how many other people fell in that category who were forcibly sterilized, where the decision was made for them that they couldn't have children.
Well, that also plays into gender issues as well. Carrie Buck in particular, when you're talking the time that she was committed and she was in Lynchburg for her sterilization. This is the period when sadly many people believe a woman who's raped asked to be raped. So you've got these gender ideas floating around that today we find abhorrent. And you have a legal framework that says you can punish the victim.
Mm-hmm. And and we've talked about Virginia being one of the leaders in eugenics. North Carolina, our neighboring state to the south, was not far behind. And
North Carolina was third in number of sterilizations. Virginia was second. California was first.
And the estimates in Virginia and North Carolina, both over 7,000 people during the decades of this program were forcibly sterilized. Now, in North Carolina, in each of the last 2 years, in their budget, there's been a proposal to compensate those living victims of this forcible sterilization program. Last year, the legislature did not provide funding for it. Recently, in North Carolina, the governor and the House of Representatives, the lower house in North Carolina, have included money in the budget to do this. However, there has been opposition to compensating these living victims in the Senate. Do you think this is something that might occur, or can you see the concerns why it may not happen?
Possibly a better question is, should it occur? When you have especially living victims of something like this, I think the argument that this is merely delayed justice is a very strong one. It reminds me of arguments when people are thrown into jail. Well, you know, you're going to ruin my life by throwing me into jail for 10 years for this crime. And the response the public usually gives is, you should have thought of that before you did it.
Right.
Now, maybe in a way this is something the state should have thought of before they did it. Will it happen? It's possible, but there is very strong opposition. Virginia, in the last few days, has introduced a similar bill.
Oh, okay.
It's now in the House of Delegates. It's House Bill 1529. And reading the impact studies on 1529, they're estimating that if only 20% of everybody who's ever sterilized were to submit a valid claim that were approved by the state and we paid out, we'd be paying out at $50,000 a person. They would be looking at $73 million paid out from Virginia to these victims over a 5-year period. Right away, that's going to get a lot of people angry over just the dollar amount.
Well, and some of the opponents of this type of legislation, I know one senator in North Carolina said, look, you know, if you allow, if you force the state to compensate people who are victimized by this program, then you're opening the door to other groups who have obviously fallen victim over the years through discrimination, that state-enforced discrimination and the like. So you go down that slippery slope. That's the argument anyway.
That's the argument. Slippery slope, of course, is a logical fallacy. Nothing says if you take step 1, you will necessarily have to take steps 2 and 3.
Well, we talked about how this program in eugenics started in Virginia in the mid-1920s. I think what might surprise some people is how long this program actually kept going. And when, what decade was it that we finally stopped sterilizing people in Virginia?
Completely or under the 1924 Act?
Let's try the 1924 Act, because I know there are some who say that it went on even after that.
Mm-hmm.
But
under the 1924 Act, the last sterilizations were in 1979 in Virginia. 2 women, I believe.
So, and I think that might be kind of shocking, because we talk about eugenics. It seems like such a backwards concept. You would
Something
think
in the distant past, we've far put it behind us.
You would think about after World War II, especially after the Americans helped defeat Nazism and the just horrid things that Hitler had done, that we would be very sensitive to those types of issues here in America. But why do you think it took so long for us to kind of get out of this pattern here in Virginia?
Well, for one thing, we never took, to use modern jargon, we never took ownership of it. At the Nuremberg trials, all the Allies were determined that the Germans were evil people. And now the Germans did take eugenics to its logical extent. If you're going to sterilize people, what's more reliable a sterilization method than death? But we basically disowned the problem. It's just the Germans are inherently evil. We have nothing to do with them. We never associated what the Germans did to the Jews with what we were doing to our populations here, our American Indians, our black populations, our women even, since women were disproportionately sterilized in greater numbers than men. Although, speaking of the Second World War, you bring up an interesting point. After the Second World War, when our veterans are coming back and they have a lot of mental problems from combat, what we today know as post-traumatic stress disorder, may manifest itself in domestic violence, alcoholism, the rates of men being sterilized in Virginia increased. Because no one understood what those conditions were. They figured that the veterans were somehow defective. And so we sterilized a lot of veterans in Virginia under the 1924 statute. Great way to thank them for their service.
And in the 1950s, we saw more issues with really part of the program of massive resistance. There was more of a racial tinge to this, where earlier on a lot of times it had been poor whites who had been the targets of sterilization.
There was also a case, I don't know if you could speak to it, the 1942 Skinner versus Oklahoma case that threw a wrench in the works of Buck versus Bell. Right,
and we're getting ready to run out of time here, Shawn, unfortunately, but we'll leave it at that. But I did want to mention this before we left today. Virginia was the first state to actually issue a formal apology about eugenics.
2001.
Mark Warner, 2001, when Mark Warner was governor, he issued this apology with the General Assembly signing on. So North Carolina recently became the 3rd state to do so after Oregon. So California, the other states, we haven't heard from yet. But thank you for joining us today on Reasonable Discourse. I think a fascinating topic. We'll see what happens here in Virginia and in North Carolina about whether or not those victims of this forcible sterilization are in fact compensated. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening.